The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and smelled of dust and old cedar. Elias Thorne sat in his cramped London apartment, staring at the wax seal. He was a freelance journalist struggling to pay rent, so when a legal firm contacted him regarding his late great-uncle Arthur's estate, he didn't hesitate. Blackwood Manor, the lawyer had whispered, is a place of history, but is also a place of weight. Elias didn't believe in weight. He believed in debt and the desperate need to escape it. 2 days later, he was driving his battered sedan through the fog-choked valleys of the Lake District. The GPS had given up miles ago. When the house finally appeared, it didn't look like a haunted mansion from a movie. It was a massive, gray-stone Victorian structure that looked tired. The windows were like cataract-filmed eyes, staring blankly at the encroaching forest. The silence was the first thing that hit him. No birds, no wind in the trees, just the sound of his own boots on the gravel. He turned the heavy iron key in the lock. The door didn't creak. It swung open with a smooth, oily silence that felt far more unnatural. "Hello," he called out. His own voice sounded flat, swallowed by the heavy velvet curtains and the thick layers of dust. As he stepped into the foyer, he felt a sudden drop in temperature. It wasn't just cold. It was a physical pressure like stepping underwater. He found a master bedroom on the second floor. On the bedside table sat an old reel-to-reel tape recorder. Beside it was a note in shaky, frantic handwriting. "Elias, do not trust the silence. If you hear the hum, leave. Don't look for the source. Just leave." Elias scoffed, tossing the note aside. He was tired. He lay down on the heavy oak bed, closing his eyes. Just as he drifted off, he heard it. Hum. A low, mechanical vibration that seemed to come from inside the walls, or perhaps from inside his own skull. The humming didn't stop. It wasn't a loud noise, but rather a persistent, physical sensation that made the water in the glass on the nightstand ripple in perfect, concentric circles. Elias sat up, his teeth aching from the vibration. He grabbed a flashlight and followed the sound. It led him away from the grand staircase and toward a narrow door tucked behind a moth-eaten tapestry. Behind it lay the servant stairs, steep, wooden, and smelling of damp earth. As he descended, the air grew thick with the scent of ozone and copper. The basement of Blackwood Manor wasn't a cellar for wine. It was a labyrinth of cramped hallways lined with filing cabinets. In the center of the main room sat a workbench covered in vacuum tubes, copper wiring, and several black and white monitors that flickered with static. Elias found a second tape. This one was labeled Frequency Test, October 14th. He pressed play. Day 42. Arthur's voice crackled through the speakers, sounding thinner and more terrified than before. "The neighbors in the village say the house is built on a thin place. I used to think that was folklore. I was wrong. It's physics. There's a frequency, low, subaudible, that thins the barrier. I caught something on the recording. It's not a ghost. It's a reflection." Suddenly, the tape went silent. Then, a sound emerged. It was the sound of someone breathing, but the rhythm was wrong. It was 3 inhales for every 1 exhale. Hoo-hoo-hoo, H-A-A. Elias froze. The sound wasn't just coming from a tape. It was echoing from the dark corner of the basement, behind the heavy boiler. He swung his flashlight toward the corner. The beam cut through the dark, revealing nothing but cobwebs and old pipes. But then, he saw it, a handprint on the dusty floor. It was fresh. The fingers were impossibly long, and where the palm should have been, the dust had been swirled into a perfect, terrifying spiral. The humming grew louder, reaching a pitch that made his ears bleed. The static on the monitors began to take shape, the silhouette of a man standing exactly where Elias was standing, but in the monitor, the man was screaming. Elias backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs. He tripped over a wire, disconnecting a large amplifier. The humming stopped instantly. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. From the darkness behind him, a voice whispered, not in his ear, but seemingly from inside his own throat. "Turn it back on, Elias." We were almost through. Elias didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He sat in the center of the kitchen, clutching a kitchen knife and a cold cup of coffee, watching the sunrise turn the fog outside into a sickly orange haze. The voice he had heard, his own voice, but distorted, haunted him. By noon, the bravado of daylight returned. He convinced himself the basement incident was a result of the ozone and sleep deprivation. Infrasound, he muttered to himself. It causes hallucinations. That's all. To distract himself, he headed to the library. It was the largest room in the house, filled from floor to ceiling with leather-bound books on architecture, radio waves, and Victorian spiritualism. While searching for a circuit diagram of the house, he noticed something odd about the shelving. The shadows didn't align with the light from the window. He pushed against a heavy mahogany shelf. With a groan of rusted hinges, a section of the wall swung inward. Behind it wasn't a room, but a narrow observation gallery. It ran the length of the house, hidden between the internal walls. Along the gallery were small, circular peepholes covered with one-way glass. Elias peered through one. He realized with a jolt of horror that he was looking into the master bedroom. He moved to the next one. It looked into the bathroom. The next, the kitchen. Arthur hadn't just lived here. He had been watching someone. Or something. At the end of the gallery sat a small desk with a single ledger. Elias opened it. The dates went back 3 years, with entries written every hour, 24 hours a day. 3:14 a.m. Subject is standing in the corner again. It is mimicking the wallpaper pattern. 3:19 a.m. Subject has moved to the ceiling. Its bones sound like dry branches breaking. 3:45 a.m. I can hear it thinking. It sounds like static. Elias felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. He looked at the most recent entry, dated the day his uncle died. 11 p.m. It knows about the inheritance. It's waiting for the new flesh. It's hungry for a new voice to steal. A soft thud came from the other side of the gallery wall. Elias froze. He leaned his eye against the nearest peephole, the one looking into the hallway. He saw himself. There, in the hallway, stood a figure wearing his denim jacket, his boots, his jeans. The Elias in the hallway was standing perfectly still, but its neck was twisted at an impossible 90-degree angle, and its eyes were nothing but hollow, black pits. The double in the hallway slowly raised a hand and pointed a long, trembling finger directly at the peephole Elias was looking through. "Found you," the double whispered. The sound didn't come from the hallway. It came from the dark gallery right behind Elias. Elias lunged for the exit of the secret gallery, his heart hammering like a trapped bird against a window pane. He burst back into the library, slamming the hidden door shut and bracing his back against it. He waited for the pounding, the scratching, or the sound of his own voice mocking him from the other side. Nothing, only the oppressive, heavy silence of the manor. He scrambled to the center of the room, his eyes darting to the hallway door. The other Elias was gone. The hallway was empty, bathed in the pale, sickly light of a dying afternoon. "It's not real," Elias gasped, his lungs burning. "It's the frequency. My brain is misfiring." He needed to leave. He grabbed his car keys from the library table, but as his fingers brushed the metal, he noticed something that turned his blood to ice. The keys were covered in a thin, translucent slime, like the trail of slug, but smelling of old, stagnant well water. He looked down at his own hands. His fingernails were turning a dull, bruised gray. Desperate for answers, Elias returned to the ledger he had snatched from the gallery desk. He flipped past the logs of observations to the very back of the book. There, Arthur had sketched a diagram. It wasn't a ghost or a demon. It was a biological anomaly. Arthur's notes below the sketch were frantic. The entity doesn't just haunt, it replaces. It starts with the sound, the frequency that softens the cellular walls. Then it mimics the sight. Finally, it consumes the original to finalize the physical bond. It needs the host to acknowledge it. Once you see it clearly, the bridge is built. Elias realized with a jolt of terror that by looking through the peephole, he had acknowledged it. Suddenly, the house's electricity flickered and died. The library plunged into a thick, velvety darkness. In the shadows of the corner, a shape began to unfold. It sounded like wet leather being stretched over bone. Click, click, click. The sound of his own tongue clicking against the roof of his mouth echoed from the corner, but Elias's mouth was clamped shut. The shape stepped into a sliver of moonlight. It was Elias, but it was wrong. The skin was too tight, pulling the corners of the mouth back into a permanent, agonizing grin. The thing was wearing the same clothes, but it moved with a jerky, twitching motion, as if its limbs were being pulled by invisible wires. Elias, the creature said. The voice was a perfect recording of Elias's mother, who had died 10 years ago. Why are you running from yourself? It took a step forward, its knees bending backward with a sickening crack. Elias didn't wait for the thing to speak again. He threw the heavy ledger at the grinning caricature of himself and bolted for the front door. He didn't care about his luggage or his laptop. He just needed the open sky. He burst through the main entrance, the cool night air hitting his face. He scrambled into his car, fumbling with the keys. The engine turned over with a desperate roar, and he floored it, the tires spitting gravel as he sped down the long, winding driveway. I'm out, he breathed, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I'm out, but as he drove, the road felt longer. He should have reached the main gates in 3 minutes. 10 minutes passed. The trees on either side of the road didn't look like English oaks anymore. They were taller, thinner, and their branches were tangled together like charred rib cages, forming a tunnel that seemed to shrink around the car. Then his headlights caught a sign. Blackwood Manor, 1 mile. No, he whispered. I'm driving away from it. He did a U-turn, tires screeching. He drove for another 5 minutes, his eyes glued to the odometer. He watched the numbers climb. Suddenly, the gray stone towers of the manor appeared through the fog again. He was back at the front door. He tried again, and again. Every road, every turn, every desperate shortcut led him back to the same gravel, circular drive. The house was a magnet, and he was the iron filing. The car's engine began to sputter. The fuel gauge, which had been half full, dropped to empty in seconds. The car rolled to a silent halt exactly where he had started. The silence returned, heavier than before. Elias sat in the dark car, his breath fogging the windows. Through the mist, he saw the front door of the manor. It was standing wide open. Inside the hallway, a light flickered on. He saw a figure sitting at the kitchen table through the window. It was his double, calmly eating a bowl of something dark and steaming. The creature looked toward the car and waved, a slow, rhythmic movement of the hand that didn't stop. Then, the car's radio turned on by itself. Static, screech, and then a recording of Elias's own voice from 5 minutes ago. I'm out. I'm out. I'm out. The voice began to slow down, deepening into a guttural growl. You are the house now. Elias looked at his hands in the dim light of the dashboard. The gray under his fingernails had spread. His skin was beginning to look like the stone of the manor, porous, cold, and cracked. Elias realized the car was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. The windows began to frost over from the inside, despite the humid night air. He stepped out of the vehicle, his legs feeling heavy like pillars of lead. He didn't walk toward the house because he wanted to. He walked because the house was pulling the iron in his blood. The double was gone from the kitchen window. The front door stood open like a hungry maw. If this is a frequency, Elias whispered, his voice sounding metallic and hollow, I have to find the source. He bypassed the basement and the library. He knew instinctively that the brain of this place was at the highest point. He climbed the grand staircase, but the steps felt endless. The architecture was warping. The hallways seemed to stretch for miles, the doors becoming smaller and more distorted. He reached the pull-down ladder for the attic. As he climbed, the humming returned, but now was a rhythmic thumping. Thump, 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 thump. The attic was filled with old mirrors, hundreds of them, of all shapes and sizes, leaning against the rafters. They were all angled toward a central point. In the middle of the room stood a massive, pulsating mass of what looked like translucent cables and organic tissue. It was wired into the very beams of the roof. Elias approached it, his flashlight flickering. Inside the translucent mass, he saw things, objects absorbed from the past. A gold watch, a pair of spectacles, and a human skull that was slowly being dissolved by the vibrating tissue. He looked into the mirrors. He didn't see himself. He saw the other Elias. But in the mirrors, the creature wasn't just a mimic. It was the true version. In the glass, the creature was vibrant and healthy, while the Elias standing in the room looked like a crumbling statue of ash and soot. The mirrors, they aren't reflecting, Elias realized, his heart slowing to match the thump of the house. They're draining. Suddenly, the mirrors began to vibrate. One by one, they cracked. The other, Elias stepped out from the largest mirror, its feet making a wet, heavy sound on the floorboards. It wasn't grinning anymore. It looked sad. The house needs a witness, Elias, the double said, its voice now perfectly indistinguishable from his own. Arthur lasted 30 years. How long will you last before you become the wallpaper? The double reached out and touched Elias's chest. Where its fingers met his skin, Elias felt a surge of agonizing cold. He looked down and saw his denim jacket turning into gray stone. The transformation was accelerating. Elias gasped as the gray petrification crawled up his neck. His joints felt stiff like rusted hinges. The other Elias stood before him, its skin supple and warm, basking in the life force it was siphoning. "You're just a recording," Elias wheezed, his throat feeling like it was lined with gravel. "A frequency, nothing more." The double tilted its head. "A recording that can breathe. A frequency that can feel." "What are you, Elias?" "A memory of a man who's already turned to stone." Elias looked at the mass of organic cables, the heart of the house. He realized the entity relied on symmetry and repetition. The mirrors, the mimicry, the repeating roads, it was all a perfect loop. To break a loop, you need an anomaly. You need something the house cannot predict because it isn't part of the script. He reached into his pocket. His fingers, stiff and gray, brushed against a small, jagged object he'd picked up in the basement. A broken vacuum tube from Arthur's old radio equipment. The house knew his DNA, his voice, and his fears, but it didn't know spontaneous pain. With a sudden, violent movement, Elias slammed the jagged glass of the vacuum tube into his own palm. The pain was electric. It was sharp, chaotic, and utterly real. Because the house was synced to his nervous system, the shock rippled through the attic like a lightning strike. The other, Elias shrieked, a sound of grinding metal and glass. The double skin began to flake off in grayscales. The mirrors in the room shattered simultaneously, the shards flying outward. The organic heart in the center of the room pulsed erratically. The thump-thump rhythm broke, stumbling into a frantic, uneven beat. "You shouldn't do that," the double groaned, its face melting like hot wax. "We are the same." "No," Elias snarled, the blood from his hand dripping onto the floor. The red liquid looked vivid and impossibly bright against the gray, dead wood of the attic. "You can copy my face, but you can't copy my blood." The blood was the key. It was biological, chaotic, and fresh. As the red droplets touched the floorboards, the wood beneath them began to smoke. The house couldn't process the life in the blood. It was like acid to the gray stone. Elias saw his chance. He crawled toward the organic heart, dragging his heavy, stone-like legs. He began to smear his blood onto the pulsating cables. The house let out a literal moan. The walls shook, and the floor tilted at a violent angle. The attic began to scream, 1,000 voices, including Arthur's, wailing in a frequency that shattered the remaining glass into dust. The manor did not simply shake, it began to fold. As Elias's blood seeped into the organic heart, the Euclidean geometry of the attic failed. The corners of the room began to tuck into themselves like wet cardboard. The ceiling dipped low, the heavy oak beams bending like rubber. The house was trying to crush the infection, which was Elias himself. "Stop it," the double screamed. Its body was now a horrific patchwork of Elias's face and raw, pulsing muscle. It lunged at him, but its movements were glitchy, its form flickering between the man and a tall, shadow-like, spindly thing. Elias ignored the pain in his hand. He grabbed the thickest organic cable, the one that seemed to lead directly down into the spine of the house, and pulled. The house let out a sound that wasn't a scream, but a structural groan. Below him, The floors began to collapse in a domino effect. He could hear the library shelves splintering and the basement monitors exploding. The gravity in the room shifted. Suddenly, the floor was a wall. Elias slid across the dusty wood, crashing into a pile of broken mirrors. The other Elias was pinned against the opposite wall, its form losing its grip on reality. It started to look like the static on the basement monitors, a gray, buzzing silhouette. "If I go, you stay," the creature hissed, its voice overlapping with 100 other voices from the house's past. "The foundation is built on us." Elias saw the exit, the small attic hatch, but it was now high above him on what used to be the sidewall. He scrambled up a leaning wardrobe, his stone-gray skin cracking with every movement. Bits of his own stone flesh fell off, revealing raw, red nerves underneath. He wasn't turning back into a human. He was being peeled. He reached the hatch and kicked it open. He didn't find the hallway. He found a void. The house had pulled itself out of the physical world. Outside the hatch was a swirling vortex of gray fog, floating debris. Pieces of furniture, old letters, and the skeletal remains of what must have been Arthur. Blackwood Manor was no longer a house in the Lake District. It was a dying pocket dimension, collapsing in on its own frequency. "Jump!" a voice whispered. Elias looked back. Standing in the center of the collapsing attic was the ghost of his uncle Arthur. Not a mimic, but a faint, glowing memory. He was holding the heart, keeping it from exploding for just a second. "Jump, Elias!" Before the loop closes, Elias looked at the gray void, then back at the other Elias, which was crawling toward him with a desperate, hungry look. Elias didn't think. He leaped into the nothingness. Falling into the void didn't feel like falling. It felt like being stretched. Elias drifted through a gray, weightless expanse where the air tasted of copper and old paper. The silence here was absolute, a vacuum that threatened to pop his eardrums. Around him, fragments of Blackwood Manor floated like driftwood in a dead sea. A grand piano drifted past, its keys playing a discordant tune without a player. A hallway of doors spiraled into the distance, leading nowhere. "Arthur," Elias called out, but no sound left his throat. His words manifested as physical letters made of ash, floating away into the gloom. He looked at his hands. The stone-gray crust was peeling away in the vacuum, but the skin underneath was translucent. He could see his own pulse, a faint, flickering blue light. He was fading. In this between, if you didn't have a physical form to anchor you, you simply evaporated. Then he saw them. Other figures were drifting in the mist. They weren't monsters, but people, dozens of them. They wore clothes from different eras, Victorian gowns, 1940s trench coats, and modern hiking gear. They were the originals. The house had stolen their lives and their voices, leaving their souls to drift here in the echo chamber while their doubles lived or died in the world above. They were all moving toward a single point of light, a tiny, vibrating needle of white glare in the far distance. Elias began to swim through the air, pushing off a floating bookshelf. As he got closer to the light, he realized what it was. It was the frequency, the original signal that had created Blackwood Manor. It wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was a tear in the fabric of reality, a puncture wound in the world. Standing near the light was the other Elias. It had followed him. It was no longer a perfect copy. It was a jagged, horrific thing of static and shadows, desperately trying to knit itself back together. It needed a body to survive the transition back to the real world. "Give it back." The creature's voice echoed in Elias's mind. The creature lunged, its fingers turning into long, sharp needles of black glass. It grabbed Elias's throat, and for a moment, their memories collided. Elias saw the creature's birth, the moment Arthur turned on the radio and the void reached out. He felt the creature's loneliness, its cold, mechanical hunger to be something. Elias realized he couldn't fight it with strength. He had to overload it. He grabbed the creature's head and, instead of pushing it away, he pulled it closer. He opened his mind to every chaotic, messy, uncopyable human emotion he had. He thought of the smell of rain on hot asphalt, the sting of a first heartbreak, the illogical fear of the dark, and the warmth of a sun he might never see again. The creature began to shake. It couldn't process the noise of true human consciousness. It was built for patterns, not the beautiful mess of a living soul. The static in the creature's form turned into a blinding white light. It began to dissolve, its scream sounding like 1,000 radios being tuned at once. The white needle of light in the center of the void began to expand, pulling Elias in. The white light didn't just blind Elias, it erased him. For a moment, he was nothing but a thought in the dark. Then, with a violent, bone-shaking jolt, reality slammed back into him. He was lying face down in cold, wet grass. The smell of damp earth and wild pine filled his lungs. He gasped, coughing up a mouthful of gray, ash-like silt. He was back in the Lake District, but the sun was rising, a real pale yellow sun that felt warm on his skin. Elias sat up, his body aching as if he'd been crushed. He looked toward the hill where Blackwood Manor had stood for over a century. The house was gone. In its place was a scorched scar on the earth, a perfect circle of blackened soil where nothing grew. No stones, no chimbir, no velvet curtains. It was as if the house had been a tooth pulled from the jaw of the world. All that remained was a faint, shimmering haze in the air that tasted of ozone. He looked at his hands. The gray stone was gone. His skin was pale and scarred, and the wound in his palm from the vacuum tube was still red and raw. It was the only thing that felt real. He walked to the road. His car was there, sitting exactly where he had first parked it on the driveway, but it was rusted and covered in decades of moss, as if it had been sitting for 50 years instead of 3 days. He checked his reflection in the wing mirror. He looked the same, but his eyes, his pupils were no longer perfectly round. They were slightly jagged, like the edges of a broken frequency. Elias began the long walk toward the nearest village. When he finally reached a small petrol station, the attendant looked at him with a mixture of pity and confusion. "You look like you've walked through a war, son," the man said, handing him a glass of water. "I'm fine," Elias whispered. But as he spoke, he noticed something. The attendant's shadow on the wall didn't move when the man moved. It stayed still for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. Elias froze. He looked at his own shadow. It was perfect. It followed him exactly. He stayed in a hotel that night, but he didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, listening. The world felt different now. He could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the buzz of the streetlights, and the distant vibration of the earth. He could hear the layers of the world. He realized then that the house hadn't been a place. It had been a filter. Now that the filter was gone, the between was everywhere. He reached into his pocket and found a small, crumpled piece of paper that shouldn't have been there. It was a note from the library ledger, but the handwriting was his own, yet he didn't remember writing it. The frequency didn't stop, Elias. It just changed stations. Look closely at the people you pass. Count their breaths. If they don't breathe, don't run. They like it when you run. Elias looked out the window at the quiet street. A woman was walking her dog. She stopped under a street lamp and looked up at his window. She waved, a slow, rhythmic movement of the hand that didn't stop. Elias didn't wave back. He closed the curtains and turned on every light in the room. He picked up a pen and a fresh notebook. Day one, he wrote, his hand trembling. I can still hear the hum. The story of Blackwood Manor hadn't ended with the house. It had simply found a new narrator. The end.